They didn't walk away because they got bored. They walked away because you passed. Let's begin with something that may feel uncomfortable but freeing at the same time. They didn't stop because they grew tired. They didn't retreat because they matured. They didn't disappear because peace suddenly mattered to them. They stopped because the ritual failed. What you went through was not random tension. It was not just a personality clash. It was not miscommunication. It was a carefully constructed humiliation cycle designed to fracture your confidence, distort your identity, and push you into submission without ever laying a hand on you. They expected tears. They expected panic. They expected self-doubt. They expected you to implode publicly or collapse privately. Instead, you endured. You did not explode in rage. You did not beg to be understood. You did not sacrifice your integrity to save your reputation. You stayed steady. And when a narcissist realizes that humiliation does not control you, the game loses its power. They don't know how to operate when shame doesn't land. They don't know how to manipulate someone who refuses to internalize the script. You passed. And once you pass, the examiner has no authority left. The humiliation ritual was a test, and you did not fail. Narcissistic systems are not chaotic. They are patterned. They may look impulsive. They may feel emotional. They may present themselves as spontaneous reactions to your behavior. But underneath the surface there is structure, there is sequencing, there is strategy. First comes subtle correction, a raised eyebrow, a light joke at your expense, a comment framed as helpful feedback. It is small enough to dismiss, harmless enough to ignore, but it plants a seed. Maybe I misstepped. Then comes public contradiction, not loud, not explosive, just enough to undermine. You say something, they gently reframe it. You share an opinion, they adjust it in front of others. You tell a story, they revise a detail. Now the seed grows. Maybe I don't remember correctly. Then comes triangulation. Someone else suddenly has concerns. Someone else noticed something too. You begin hearing about conversations you were not part of. You are now reacting to a narrative that has already been circulated. Then comes distortion. Your tone is reinterpreted. Your boundaries are labeled harsh. Your clarity is described as aggression. Your discernment is called paranoia. And finally comes social pressure. The room shifts. The energy changes. Neutral faces turn cautious. You sense it, something has moved against you. Each stage is a test. Will you apologize for something you didn't do? Will you shrink so others feel comfortable? Will you silence your intuition to preserve peace? Will you accept a false identity just to end the tension? The humiliation ritual is not about destroying you in one dramatic moment. It is about calculating how much of yourself you are willing to surrender in order to survive socially. That is the real measurement. Not your competence, not your morality, not your character, but your threshold for self-abandonment. And here is what changed everything. You stopped abandoning yourself. You may not have done it loudly. You may not have declared it publicly, but internally, something locked into place. You felt the sting of misrepresentation. You felt the ache of watching others hesitate around you. You felt the quiet panic of wondering how your name became attached to a version of you that did not exist. You questioned yourself. Of course you did. You replayed conversations. You examined tone. You searched for blind spots. But you did not override your inner witness. That inner witness, that steady, unshakable awareness, is sacred. It is the place where conscience, clarity, and the spirit intersect. It is the place where truth is not loud, but firm, and you chose to trust it. That choice cost you something. It cost you immediate validation. It cost you group approval. It cost you the comfort of being universally understood, but it preserved your integrity. Scripture reminds us that truth sets us free, but before truth liberates, it isolates. Before it restores, it exposes. And exposure makes people uncomfortable, especially those invested in maintaining illusions. You became inconvenient, not because you attacked, not because you retaliated, but because you did not collapse. They needed you to fail the test so they could reinforce the hierarchy. They needed you to internalize the shame so they could maintain the narrative. They needed you to doubt your perception so they could define reality for you. But you did something radical. You allowed the discomfort without rewriting yourself to relieve it. You sat in the loneliness. You endured the silence. You carried the misunderstanding, and you refused to confess to a crime you did not commit. The humiliation ritual only works when shame becomes internal. When shame remains external, when it is recognized as projection rather than truth, the mechanism breaks. And that is exactly what happened. The leverage disappeared. They could not escalate indefinitely, because escalation requires submission. They could not continue refining the narrative, because you stopped cooperating with it. You did not fight them publicly, and that unsettled them. You did not collapse privately, and that frustrated them. You did not beg for reinstatement, and that destabilized them. When a narcissistic structure realizes it cannot bend your identity, it loses its primary tool. And systems without leverage cannot sustain dominance. They wanted you paralyzed, but discernment woke you up. The goal was never physical harm. It was paralysis. They did not need you destroyed. They needed you destabilized. They did not need you gone. They needed you uncertain. They wanted you alive, but second-guessing, present, but hesitant, capable, but doubting your own capability. Because spiritual paralysis is far more useful to a narcissistic structure than open conflict. Conflict can be confronted. Conflict can be named. Conflict can even be resolved. But paralysis? Paralysis keeps you suspended. It keeps you quiet. It keeps you dependent on external interpretation. If you are confused, they can guide the narrative. If you are ashamed, they can redirect blame. If you question your own memory, they can rewrite history. If you distrust your intuition, they can position themselves as your compass. That is control at its most refined level. You begin to filter your thoughts before speaking. You begin to rehearse conversations in advance. You begin to monitor your tone, your posture, your wording. You shrink not because you are weak, but because you are trying to avoid further damage. And that shrinking is what they were counting on. Paralysis is not dramatic, it is quiet erosion. It is the slow dimming of confidence. It is the subtle disconnection from your own internal authority. But something happened. Your discernment activated. It did not arrive like thunder. It did not come with a confrontation or a scene. It came as a steady internal unease, a persistent sense that something beneath the surface did not align with the surface presentation. Discernment is not suspicion. It is clarity without noise. Suspicion is anxious and reactive. Discernment is calm and grounded. Suspicion seeks proof. Discernment recognizes pattern, and patterns began to emerge. The same accusation repeated in different tones. Casual one day, concerned the next, irritated the next, but always circling the same theme. The same story told with minor revisions depending on the audience. The same subtle jab, disguised as humor, followed by, "You're too sensitive." The same cycle of offense followed by false reconciliation, tension, confrontation, apology, reset, and then repetition. You began noticing the timing. You began noticing who was present when certain comments were made. You began noticing how narratives shifted, depending on who was listening. At first, you thought you were overthinking. You gave grace. You gave benefit of the doubt. You prayed for understanding. You examined yourself honestly. But discernment does not vanish when ignored. It grows clearer. You realize that what felt confusing was not your weakness. It was their inconsistency. You stopped reacting and started observing. That shift was everything. When you react emotionally, you are inside the storm. When you observe spiritually, you rise above it. Observation creates distance. Distance creates clarity. Clarity creates freedom. You began to respond less and listen more. You spoke fewer words but paid closer attention. You asked internal questions instead of defending externally. And slowly, the fog lifted. You saw that the misunderstandings followed a rhythm. You saw that the concerns only surfaced when you asserted a boundary. You saw that the tension increased whenever you demonstrated independence. It was never random. It was triggered by your strength. Discernment exposed that the discomfort in the room was not caused by your character, but by your clarity. When you stopped absorbing misplaced shame, the emotional atmosphere shifted. And here is what narcissistic structures fear most: being seen, not publicly humiliated, not criticized. Seen. Seen clearly, seen accurately, seen without illusion. When discernment awakens, manipulation becomes visible, and visible manipulation loses its mystique. You passed because you refused to play by their rules. They were waiting for you to lash out. They were waiting for the moment your voice would rise just enough to be labeled unstable. They were waiting for one sharp response, one frustrated text, one emotional outburst they could freeze in time and replay as proof. They were waiting for a scene. Not because they love chaos for its own sake, but because chaos is currency in a narcissistic system. A scene provides material. A scene creates witnesses. A scene supplies narrative fuel. They were waiting for a breakdown, because a breakdown confirms the story they have already been whispering. It validates their quiet warnings about you. It justifies the pressure they applied. It transforms their provocation into your overreaction. Why? Because reaction justifies retaliation. Reaction provides evidence. Reaction fuels narrative control. When you react explosively, they regain authority. When you defend yourself frantically, they reposition you as unstable. When you argue point by point, they accuse you of being obsessed. The trap is carefully designed. But you did something they did not anticipate. You withdrew your participation. Not dramatically, not with announcement, not with a speech declaring your independence. You simply stopped stepping into the arena. You did not defend yourself endlessly. You did not argue every distortion. You did not chase every misunderstanding. You did not compete for public sympathy. You stepped back. That step back was not weakness. It was wisdom. There is a profound difference between defending truth and defending ego. Truth does not require frantic protection. Ego does. You recognize that if something must be shouted constantly to survive, it may not be grounded in reality. Narcissistic dynamics depend on emotional engagement. They thrive on tension loops: provoke, react, escalate, reconcile, repeat. Without your reaction, the loop breaks. Without engagement, there is no spectacle. Without spectacle, there is no audience. Without audience, there is no power. When you refused to perform your role in the script collapsed. You deprived the system of oxygen, and when oxygen disappears, fire dies. At first, this unsettled them. They increased pressure. They sharpened comments. They attempted one more subtle provocation, because when control weakens, escalation often follows. But you did not bite. You did not meet aggression with aggression. You did not meet distortion with desperation. You did not meet accusation with rage. You chose steadiness over spectacle. and steadiness terrifies instability. Instability feeds on visible emotion. It searches for tremors in your voice, cracks in your composure, inconsistencies in your posture. When those tremors never arrive, instability loses its grip. Your composure forced them to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Their tactics were ineffective. You were supposed to spiral. You were supposed to panic. You were supposed to beg for clarity. Instead, you grew quieter, not withdrawn in defeat, but grounded in self-possession. There is something profoundly unsettling to a narcissistic personality about someone who does not need to win publicly, because public victory is the primary currency of ego-driven dynamics. If you refuse the stage, they are left performing alone, and a solo performance without applause feels hollow. You understood something they hoped you never would. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. You do not have to correct every falsehood in real time. You do not have to respond to every insinuation. You do not have to defend your character to those committed to misunderstanding it. Sometimes the most powerful statement is strategic absence. When you stopped providing reaction, the game lost its purpose. Narcissistic behavior feeds on supply, not just attention, but emotional energy, outrage, tears, confusion, urgency, defense, the frantic need to explain, the desperate attempt to repair reputation, the visible struggle to hold yourself together under scrutiny. That energy is the fuel. When someone provokes you and you respond intensely, even if you are justified, the narcissistic system interprets that response as confirmation of relevance. You are engaged, you are invested, you are emotionally hooked. And as long as you are hooked, the cycle continues. But when you ceased providing that energy, something shifted. You did not stop caring about truth. You did not stop valuing integrity. You simply stopped feeding distortion. That difference is everything. At first, they did not understand what was happening. There was a brief escalation, a sharper comment disguised as just being honest, a louder accusation delivered in front of others, a more public attempt to force your hand, because when control begins to slip, pressure increases. They tested one more time. Would this provoke you? Would this finally make you snap? Would this draw out the reaction they needed to regain narrative authority? But you did not take the bait, and in that restraint, the structure began to wobble. The humiliation ritual depends on shame being internalized. It requires you to absorb the accusation and then scramble to prove your innocence. It requires you to feel exposed, to feel small, to feel defensive. But if you refuse to carry the shame, it remains where it originated. And that is unbearable for someone who built their identity on external validation. Because if you do not accept the distorted label, they are forced to confront their own projection. If you do not embody the guilt they assign, the spotlight turns back toward the source. Without your reaction, their performance exposed itself. There is something deeply revealing about one-sided hostility. When someone continues pushing, accusing, provoking, and the other person remains measured, observers begin to sense imbalance. Not because you campaign for sympathy, not because you defend yourself loudly, but because composure under pressure creates contrast. Contrast invites clarity. People begin to notice when hostility is disproportionate. When someone works tirelessly to provoke a response and receives calm instead, the imbalance becomes obvious. What once looked like justified confrontation begins to resemble obsession. The stage they built to embarrass you became a spotlight, revealing their fixation. Every additional jab without reaction highlighted the pattern. Every attempt to escalate without engagement underscored the desperation. Every public push, without private resolution, signaled that something deeper was at work. and obsession without success becomes humiliation for the aggressor. The very mechanism designed to shame you began turning inward, because shame, when not absorbed by the intended target, reflects back. You did not need to retaliate. You did not need to dismantle them publicly. You did not need to recruit allies or issue statements. Your calm was louder than argument. It takes strength to remain unhooked. It takes discipline to resist the urge to clear your name in every room. It takes faith to believe that truth does not require frantic defense. But you did it. You allowed silence to work. You allowed time to reveal. You allowed imbalance to speak for itself. And as the imbalance grew more visible, the game lost its appeal. Narcissistic dynamics require payoff. They require emotional return on investment. If every attempt at provocation yields composure, if every accusation yields restraint, if every escalation yields disengagement, the return diminishes. Eventually, the effort outweighs the reward. They don't want to play anymore because the game no longer benefits them. They don't want to play because they cannot win. You see the pattern now, not vaguely, not emotionally, clearly. What once felt confusing now feels predictable. What once felt personal now feels patterned. What once felt like isolated incidents now reveals itself as a repeated cycle with familiar stages. You recognize projection. When they accuse you of what they themselves are doing, when they assign motives to you that mirror their own behavior, when they describe you as manipulative while quietly steering conversations behind closed doors, projection once unsettled you. Now it informs you. You identify gaslighting, the subtle denial of events that clearly happened, the confident rephrasing of conversations you remember accurately, the insistence that your emotional response is the problem, rather than the behavior that triggered it. Gaslighting once made you question your perception. Now it signals insecurity. You notice triangulation, the third-party conversations, the carefully planted doubts, the "I'm just concerned about them" whispers, the indirect communication designed to fragment unity and isolate you. Triangulation once made you defensive. Now it makes you observant. You understand baiting, the offhand comment designed to trigger you, the half-joke meant to provoke, the public correction delivered with a smile, the push, followed by the watchful pause waiting for your reaction. Baiting once stirred your frustration. Now it reveals desperation. Once awareness enters the room, manipulation loses its camouflage. It cannot operate in secrecy when you recognize its rhythm. It cannot distort effectively when you track consistency. It cannot destabilize you when you refuse to outsource your perception. They cannot reset the cycle because you have memory. You remember how the apology came last time and what followed it. You remember how the reconciliation was framed and how quickly the tension returned. You remember the exact tone shift that preceded the accusation. Memory protects you from re-entry. They cannot rewrite history because you document reality internally. You do not need a public record. You carry an internal archive. You do not erase events to maintain comfort. You do not minimize patterns to preserve peace. You hold the timeline. And when someone cannot erase your internal timeline, their ability to redefine reality diminishes. They cannot redefine you because you stopped seeking their approval. That is the turning point. Approval was once the hook, the desire to be understood, the hope that fairness would eventually prevail, the longing for relational stability. But once you detached your identity from their validation, the leverage dissolved. You no longer wait for them to acknowledge your integrity. You no longer crave their endorsement of your character. You no longer depend on their narrative to define your worth. You stand independently. Narcissistic dynamics require one person to remain unsure of their memory, unsure of their motives, unsure of their emotional responses, unsure of their value. As long as one person questions themselves, the other maintains control. But once both parties are aware, the imbalance collapses. You are no longer confused. Confusion created vulnerability. Clarity creates boundaries. You are no longer scrambling to fix what you did not break. That scrambling was part of the ritual. You rush to repair. You volunteer to reconcile. You over-explain to stabilize the dynamic. You apologize for the discomfort you did not cause. But you stopped scrambling. You began asking a different question. Why am I repairing something I did not fracture? That question dismantles manipulation. You are no longer volunteering to be the scapegoat. The scapegoat absorbs collective tension. The scapegoat restores equilibrium by accepting blame. The scapegoat makes dysfunction tolerable for the group. When you withdraw from that role, discomfort rises. Because if you are not the problem, then the problem must be addressed. And addressing the problem requires self-examination. Most narcissistic structures avoid self-examination at all costs. Self-examination threatens image. It challenges narrative. It destabilizes ego. It invites accountability. So when the scapegoat steps aside, the system must confront itself. And that confrontation is intolerable for those unwilling to change. Most narcissistic structures prefer new supply over self-reflection. New supply does not carry memory. New supply does not recognize pattern. New supply does not question the narrative. New supply is still uncertain, so they leave. Not because they healed, not because they matured, not because they finally understood you. They leave because you became unmanageable. Your silence was not weakness. It was strategy. They interpreted your restraint as fragility. They watched you decline the argument, step back from the accusation, refuse the spectacle, and they assumed you were intimidated. They believed your quiet meant you had no defense. They assumed your calm meant you were cornered. They mistook dignity for defeat. But silence can be deeply powerful. In a world that rewards loud rebuttals and public vindication, quiet strength is often misunderstood. Noise feels like power. Volume feels like control. But true authority does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply refuses to engage. Silence prevents escalation. Silence disrupts drama cycles. Silence denies performative conflict. Silence preserves energy. When you refuse to respond impulsively, you interrupt the pattern. Narcissistic dynamics rely on predictable reactions. A provocation is launched. A reaction is expected. The reaction is used as evidence, and the narrative advances. But silence stalls the machinery. When there is no reaction to amplify, escalation falters. When there is no counterattack to dissect, the narrative weakens. When there is no public defense to argue against, the spectacle collapses. There is a difference between silence born of fear and silence born of confidence. Silence born of fear is anxious. It avoids eye contact. It feels small. It suppresses truth to survive. Silence born of confidence is steady. It is grounded. It does not rush. It does not tremble. It knows that truth does not require frantic repetition. You were not silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because not every arena deserves your voice. You recognize that some conversations are not about resolution, they are about reaction. Some accusations are not about clarity, they are about control. Some public confrontations are not about truth, they are about spectacle. And you refuse to supply spectacle. There is strength in discerning where your words will be honored and where they will be weaponized. There is wisdom in recognizing that defending yourself endlessly only binds you tighter to a distorted narrative. When truth does not require constant defense, it stands on its own. Truth has weight, it has consistency. It does not panic under pressure. It does not reshape itself to win approval. It remains aligned even when misunderstood. You trusted that alignment. You did not rush to correct every rumor. You did not scramble to dismantle every insinuation. You did not chase every room to restore your image. Instead, you allowed time to work. Time revealed inconsistencies. Time exposed contradictions. Time unveiled character. Patterns cannot hide indefinitely. Tone cannot remain masked forever. A narrative built on distortion eventually fractures under its own weight. You did not need to prosecute your case publicly. Reality did that quietly. There is something profoundly unsettling to those who thrive on chaos when their target refuses to compete. They expect you to defend yourself with urgency. They anticipate visible distress. They rely on your anxiety to validate their accusations. But when you remain steady, their aggression becomes disproportionate. Your calm becomes contrast. Contrast creates clarity. Restraint requires strength. Reaction requires impulse. Impulse is immediate. It satisfies the moment. It feels justified. But impulse can be steered. It can be manipulated. It can be framed. Restraint demands discipline. It requires self-governance. It requires trust that not every battle needs to be fought in real time. You chose strength. You chose composure over retaliation. You chose alignment over argument. You chose patience over panic. And strength without noise unsettles those who thrive on chaos. You passed, and now you are no longer a target. You passed, not because it did not hurt, not because you were untouched by humiliation, not because you were never misunderstood. You passed because the ritual did not reprogram you. The humiliation was designed to alter your self-perception. It was meant to make you smaller, quieter, more compliant. It was meant to convince you that peace required your self-erasure. It was meant to train you to apologize for your strength and dilute your clarity. But it failed. You may have questioned yourself for a season. You may have replayed conversations. You may have prayed for understanding and searched your heart honestly. But in the end, you did not betray your inner witness. And that is the passing grade. You are no longer a target not because narcissistic personalities cease to exist, but because you are no longer compatible with their system. You recognize projection. You identify gaslighting. You see triangulation forming before it solidifies. You sense bait before it hooks. The same tactics that once destabilized you now register as patterns. And patterns lose their power when they are named. You are no longer easily provoked. You are no longer easily shamed. You are no longer easily maneuvered into defending yourself in arenas designed to exhaust you. That is growth. That is maturity, anchored in discernment. And here is the value for you, not just as someone who survived, but as someone who desires to live wisely moving forward. You now understand that not every conflict requires engagement. You now know that integrity does not need constant defense. You now trust that silence can be strength. You now recognize that peace sometimes requires strategic distance. This experience did not just expose narcissistic behavior. It refined you. It sharpened your discernment. It strengthened your boundaries. It clarified your identity. You learned to separate conviction from accusation. You learned to differentiate guilt from manipulation. You learned that humility does not mean accepting false blame. That knowledge is not merely survival, it is protection. Moving forward, you do not have to live guarded, but you do live aware. You do not have to assume the worst in people, but you no longer ignore patterns. You do not have to prove yourself constantly, but you do protect your peace intentionally. You passed, and because you passed, you are no longer useful to dysfunction. Narcissistic dynamics seek compliance, confusion, and emotional volatility. You offer none of those now. You offer steadiness. You offer clarity. You offer boundaries. And systems built on manipulation cannot thrive in the presence of clarity. So they move on, not because you were defeated, but because you became unmanageable to control. There is something profoundly freeing about realizing you no longer fit the script that once confined you. You are not obligated to return to spaces that required your self-doubt. You are not required to explain your growth to those invested in your old role. You are not responsible for carrying shame that never belonged to you. What they meant to use as humiliation became formation. What they meant to use as exposure became refinement. What they meant to use as control became your awakening. And here is the quiet truth that anchors all of it. You did not overcome by overpowering anyone. You overcame by remaining aligned. Aligned with truth. Aligned with conscience. Aligned with the quiet strength that refuses to abandon itself under pressure. That alignment is your safeguard now. It will guide future relationships. It will steady future conflicts. It will whisper when something is not right. It will anchor you when tension rises. You passed. And because you passed, you walk differently now, not hardened, not cynical, not suspicious, but grounded. Grounded in truth, grounded in discernment, grounded in a peace that no longer depends on approval. You are no longer a target because you are no longer available for manipulation. And that is not just the end of a ritual. It is the beginning of freedom,